Sarah Martinez had always been different from other girls her age. At 22, she stood barely 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed no more than 115 pounds. Her small frame and quiet demeanor made people think she was fragile, like a porcelain doll that might break if handled too roughly. But Sarah carried herself with a dignity that few people noticed, walking with her head held high even when others whispered behind her back. Growing up in a rough neighborhood in Detroit, Sarah learned early that being small didn't mean being weak. Her father had left when she was 8, leaving her mother to raise 3 children alone. Sarah was the youngest, with 2 older brothers who joined gangs before they turned 16. Her mother worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, leaving Sarah to fend for herself most of the time. The other kids at school called her names. Tiny, they would say, or Mouse. Some of the crueler ones called her Breakable Barbie. Sarah never responded to their taunts. She would simply look them in the eye for a moment, then continue on her way. This quiet confidence frustrated her tormentors, who wanted to see her cry or fight back. But Sarah had learned something important from watching her mother struggle every day. Real strength came from within, not from how loud you could shout or how hard you could hit. When Sarah graduated high school, she shocked everyone by announcing she was joining the Marines. Her guidance counselor tried to talk her out of it, suggesting she consider college or a nice office job instead. Her mother cried, worried that her baby girl wouldn't survive the harsh military training. Her brothers laughed, saying she'd be back home within a week, probably in tears. But Sarah had made up her mind. She had researched everything about the Marines, read every manual she could find, and watched countless documentaries about military life. She knew it would be hard, perhaps the hardest thing she'd ever do. But she also knew it was her chance to prove to herself and everyone else that she was more than what they saw on the surface. The day she left for boot camp at Paris Island, only her mother came to see her off at the bus station. Sarah hugged her tight, feeling the woman's thin shoulders shake with worry. "I'll be fine, Mama," she whispered. "I promise I'll make you proud." As the bus pulled away, Sarah watched her neighborhood disappear through the window. The broken streetlights, the abandoned buildings, the groups of young men hanging on street corners, all of it faded into the distance. She was leaving behind everything she'd ever known, heading toward something that terrified and excited her in equal measure. The journey to South Carolina took 18 hours. Sarah sat quietly in her seat, reading a small notebook where she'd written down everything she thought might help her survive the next 13 weeks. She'd memorized the Marine Corps values: honor, courage, and commitment. She'd practiced the basic exercises until her muscles ached. She'd even learned some of the military terminology, so she wouldn't be completely lost when the drill instructors started shouting orders. Other recruits on the bus were loud and boastful, talking about how tough they were and how easy boot camp would be for them. Sarah listened but didn't join in. She knew that talking big was often a sign of inner doubt, and she had no interest in setting herself up for embarrassment. Instead, she focused on staying calm and preparing mentally for what was ahead. When they finally arrived at Paris Island, the reality of what she'd signed up for hit her like a physical blow. The place was massive, with buildings stretched out as far as she could see. Everything was precise and orderly, from the perfectly trimmed grass to the straight lines of the walkways. Even the air felt different here, charged with discipline and purpose. As they were herded off the bus, Sarah caught her first glimpse of the drill instructors waiting for them. These weren't the friendly recruiters who had smiled and encouraged her to join. These were hard-faced men and women who looked like they could break someone in half without breaking a sweat. Their uniforms were perfect, their posture was perfect, and their expressions promised that the next few months would be anything but easy. Sarah took a deep breath and straightened her shoulders. She'd come too far to back down now. Whatever these drill instructors threw at her, she would find a way to handle it. She thought of her mother working double shifts, of her brothers who'd given up on their dreams, of all the people who'd told her she wasn't strong enough. She was here to prove them all wrong. The first drill instructor approached their group, his voice booming across the parade deck as he began to separate the new recruits into platoons. Sarah's heart pounded, but she kept her face calm and focused. This was just the beginning, and she intended to see it through to the end, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. The first day at boot camp was worse than anything Sarah had imagined. Within minutes of stepping off the bus, she was assigned to 2nd Platoon along with 79 other recruits. Their senior drill instructor was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, a man whose voice could probably be heard 3 buildings away. But it was the other drill instructors who caught Sarah's attention, particularly the 5 who seemed to take an immediate dislike to her. Sergeant Thompson was the tallest of them, standing well over 6 feet with arms like tree trunks. He looked at Sarah during the initial lineup and shook his head with disgust. "What is this?" he muttered to the other instructors. "Did someone's little sister get lost on her way to cheerleading practice?" Sergeant Williams was built like a bulldozer, with a thick neck and hands that looked like they could crush steel. He walked up to Sarah during the first inspection and looked her up and down with obvious disapproval. "Martinez," he read from his clipboard, "you better have some hidden talents, because I don't see how someone your size is going to make it through week 1, let alone 13 weeks. Sergeant Johnson was known for his creative punishments. He had a way of finding exactly what would break a recruit's spirit, then pushing that button repeatedly. When he saw Sarah struggling with her heavy gear bag on the first day, he smiled in a way that made her stomach sink. "Looks like we got ourselves a special case here, boys," he announced to his fellow instructors. Sergeant Davis was the meanest of them all. He seemed to take personal offense to Sarah's presence, as if her very existence insulted everything the Marines stood for. During their first meal in the chow hall, he stopped at Sarah's table and stared at her untouched food. "What's wrong, Martinez? The food not fancy enough for you? Maybe you're used to someone cutting it up into little pieces for you." The 5th instructor, Sergeant Brooks, was different from the others. He was quieter but somehow more intimidating. He watched Sarah with calculating eyes, as if he was studying her weaknesses and planning exactly how to exploit them. He never raised his voice or made crude comments like the others. But his cold stare made Sarah feel like he could see right through her. These 5 instructors seemed to have made an unspoken agreement that Sarah was their special project. While the other recruits dealt with the normal intensity of Marine boot camp, Sarah faced something much worse. Every mistake she made was amplified. Every success was dismissed or ignored. Every moment of weakness was seized upon and used against her. During the first week, Sarah struggled with the physical demands just like many other recruits. The difference was that when others stumbled during a run, they got shouted at and told to keep moving. When Sarah stumbled, she got extra laps, extra push-ups, and lectures about how she was wasting everyone's time. The other recruits began to notice the unfair treatment. Some felt sorry for Sarah, but they were too afraid to say anything. Others started to resent her, believing that her presence was making things harder for everyone. A few recruits, led by a loud girl named Jackson from Texas, began to echo the instructor's cruel comments. "She's going to get us all in trouble," Jackson whispered to the others during one of their brief rest periods. "They're being extra hard on all of us because she's here. She should just quit and save us all the hassle." Sarah heard these whispers, but she refused to let them break her spirit. Every morning, she woke up at 4:30 a.m. along with everyone else. She made her bed with military precision, even though Sergeant Thompson would inevitably find something wrong with it and make her do it again. She ate her meals quickly and quietly, while the 5 instructors took turns making comments about her size, her strength, and her chances of survival. The physical training was brutal for everyone, but Sarah's small frame made everything twice as difficult. The obstacle course seemed designed for people twice her size. The rope climbing required upper body strength she'd never needed before. The long runs with full gear left her gasping and struggling to keep up with recruits who had natural athletic advantages. But every evening, after the other recruits had collapsed into their bunks, Sarah would lie awake reviewing everything that had happened that day. She would identify her mistakes and figure out how to avoid them tomorrow. She would think about techniques that might help her overcome her physical limitations. Most importantly, she would remind herself why she was there and what she was trying to prove. During the second week, Sergeant Johnson decided to test just how far he could push her. During a particularly difficult obstacle course run, he positioned himself at the rope climb, the obstacle that gave Sarah the most trouble. As she approached, struggling with the thick rope and her own body weight, he began his commentary. "Look at this, everyone," he called out to the other recruits who were waiting their turn. "Martinez here thinks she's going to be a Marine. She can't even climb a simple rope. How's she going to carry a wounded fellow Marine to safety? How's she going to handle real combat when she can't handle basic training?" Sarah's arms were burning, her grip was slipping, and she was only halfway up the rope. The other recruits were watching, some with sympathy, others with the cruel curiosity that comes when someone else is suffering. But instead of giving up, Sarah found something inside herself that she didn't know existed. She looked down at Sergeant Johnson's sneering face and felt not shame but determination. By the third week of boot camp, something began to change in Sarah. The constant pressure from the 5 drill instructors had pushed her to a breaking point, but instead of breaking, she had begun to transform. Every cruel comment, every unfair punishment, every moment of public humiliation had been building something inside her that she was only now beginning to understand. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine inspection. Sergeant Davis was examining Sarah's locker, looking for any excuse to punish her. He found a microscopic wrinkle in one of her shirts and exploded into a rage that seemed completely out of proportion to the offense. "Martinez," he screamed, his face turning red with anger. "Are you trying to make a mockery of this uniform? Are you showing disrespect to every Marine who has ever worn these colors?" He threw her carefully folded clothes onto the floor, scattering them across the barracks. "Since you obviously don't know how to take care of your gear, you can spend the next 3 hours reorganizing your entire locker. And while you're doing that, you can think about whether you really belong here." As Sarah knelt on the floor, picking up her scattered belongings while the other drill instructors made additional cruel comments, something clicked in her mind. She realized that their treatment of her had nothing to do with her actual performance or her potential as a Marine. They were trying to break her spirit simply because they believed she didn't belong there. But as she folded each piece of clothing with precise military corners, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She wasn't going to just survive their abuse anymore. She was going to excel in spite of it. She was going to become the Marine they said she could never be. And she was going to do it so completely and so perfectly that they would have no choice but to respect her. That evening, while the other recruits slept, Sarah began her own private training regimen. She would wake up 30 minutes before the official wake-up call and practice her weakest skills. If rope climbing was her weakness, she would find ways to build the specific muscles she needed. If the obstacle course gave her trouble, she would mentally rehearse every movement until she could do it in her sleep. Sarah also began studying the 5 instructors who had made her life miserable. She watched how they moved, how they spoke, what they valued, and what impressed them. She realized that each of them had different triggers and different expectations. Sergeant Thompson respected raw determination. Sergeant Williams appreciated technical precision. Sergeant Johnson valued mental toughness under pressure. Sergeant Davis wanted to see absolute dedication to Marine values. Sergeant Brooks was looking for strategic thinking and adaptability. Instead of trying to avoid these instructors, Sarah began positioning herself where they would notice her improvements. When Sergeant Thompson was watching, she pushed herself harder than ever during physical training. When Sergeant Williams was conducting inspections, her gear was not just acceptable but exemplary. When Sergeant Johnson created stressful situations, Sarah remained calm and focused. When Sergeant Davis tested her knowledge of Marine history and values, she had answers that went beyond what was required. When Sergeant Brooks presented tactical problems, Sarah's solutions showed she was thinking like a future leader. The other recruits began to notice the change in Sarah as well. Jackson, who had been so critical before, stopped making snide comments when she saw Sarah volunteering for extra duties and helping other struggling recruits with their equipment. Some of the recruits who had felt sorry for Sarah began to see her as an inspiration rather than a victim. But the 5 drill instructors were not ready to give up their campaign against her. As they saw Sarah improving, they began to increase their pressure, believing they could still break her if they just pushed hard enough. This led to what would later be remembered as the most intense week of boot camp that anyone in 2nd Platoon had ever experienced. Sergeant Davis decided to test Sarah's commitment during a night navigation exercise. While other recruits were given standard maps and compasses, Sarah was given equipment that had been deliberately tampered with. Her compass was slightly off and her map was missing crucial landmarks. The exercise was designed to be impossible for her to complete successfully. As Sarah realized what was happening, she had 2 choices. She could complain about the unfair treatment and demand better equipment, or she could find a way to succeed anyway. She chose the harder path. Using stars for navigation and carefully observing the terrain around her, Sarah not only completed the exercise but finished faster than half the recruits who had proper equipment. When she reported back to Sergeant Davis, he stared at her with a mixture of surprise and annoyance. He had expected her to fail spectacularly, giving him another reason to humiliate her in front of the platoon. Instead, she had demonstrated skills that most Marines never develop, turning his sabotage into her triumph. Sergeant Brooks watched this entire incident from a distance, and for the first time Sarah saw something in his expression that might have been respect. He approached her after the exercise was over when the other instructors weren't watching. "Martinez," he said quietly, "that was good work out there. Real good work." He paused for a moment, studying her face. "You're not what we expected when you first got here." Sarah looked him straight in the eye, her voice steady and confident. "With respect, Sergeant Brooks, I'm exactly what you should have expected. I'm here to become a Marine, and that's exactly what I'm going to do." That night, as Sarah cleaned her rifle and prepared for the next day's challenges, she realized something important had changed. She wasn't afraid anymore. The 5 instructors who had seemed so intimidating just a few weeks ago were beginning to look like just another obstacle to overcome. And Sarah was getting very good at overcoming obstacles. Week 7 marked the beginning of what Marines call the crucible phase of training. But for Sarah, the real crucible had started the moment she stepped off that bus 7 weeks ago. By now, her transformation was becoming impossible to ignore, even for the 5 drill instructors who had been so determined to break her. The physical changes were obvious to everyone. Sarah had gained 15 pounds of pure muscle. Her shoulders had broadened, her arms had developed definition that surprised even her, and her endurance had increased dramatically. She could now complete the obstacle course in times that ranked her in the top third of her platoon. Her rifle scores had consistently improved until she was out shooting recruits who claimed to have been hunting since childhood. But the mental changes were even more impressive. Sarah had developed a quiet confidence that was different from arrogance or bravado. When other recruits panicked under pressure, Sarah remained calm and focused. When complex problems arose during training exercises, Sarah was often the first to see the solution. When the instructors tried to create chaos and confusion, Sarah seemed to find order in the middle of it all. The other recruits had begun looking to her for leadership, even though she had never asked for that role. During a particularly difficult team exercise, when their assigned squad leader had frozen under pressure, it was Sarah who quietly took charge and guided the team to success. She did it so naturally that many people didn't even realize what had happened until afterwards. This growing respect from her fellow recruits was exactly what the 5 drill instructors had been trying to prevent. They had wanted to make her an example of what happened to people who didn't belong in the Marines. Instead, she was becoming an example of what was possible when someone refused to give up. Sergeant Thompson was the first to crack. During a battalion run that should have left Sarah struggling at the back of the formation, she maintained her position in the front third while helping 2 other recruits who were genuinely struggling. After the run, Thompson pulled her aside, his usual hostility replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. "Martinez," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What you did back there, helping those other recruits while maintaining your own pace, that was good Marine leadership." He paused, clearly struggling with words he didn't want to say. "I may have misjudged you when you first got here." Sarah stood at attention, her response respectful but firm. "Thank you, Sergeant Thompson. I've always known what I was capable of. I just needed the chance to prove it." Sergeant Williams was next. During a complex weapons training exercise, Sarah not only mastered her own assignments but helped explain difficult concepts to other recruits who were struggling. Williams watched her patiently working with a recruit who had failed the same exercise 3 times, never showing frustration or impatience. After the exercise, Williams approached Sarah with something that almost looked like admiration. "You've got natural teaching ability, Martinez. The way you broke down that procedure for Johnson, that was textbook instructor technique. Have you ever considered becoming a drill instructor yourself?" Sarah was surprised by the question, but her answer was immediate. "I want to be the best Marine I can be, Sergeant Williams. If that path leads to becoming an instructor, then I'll be honored to help train the next generation." Sergeant Johnson's change of heart came during what was supposed to be Sarah's most humiliating moment. He had designed a scenario where she would be forced to fail in front of the entire platoon, a complex tactical problem with no good solution. Sarah was given command of a simulated patrol that was supposed to walk into an ambush with no way to avoid casualties. But Sarah had been studying tactical manuals during her free time, And she saw something that Sergeant Johnson hadn't expected her to notice. Instead of following the obvious route into the ambush, she led her team on a longer but safer path that allowed them to approach the enemy position from an unexpected angle. Not only did her patrol avoid the ambush, but they successfully completed their mission with 0 simulated casualties. Sergeant Johnson stared at the tactical map in disbelief. The scenario had been designed by experienced combat veterans to be impossible for a recruit to solve. Yet Sarah had found a solution that would have impressed seasoned Marines. "Martinez," he said slowly. "That was advanced tactical thinking. Where did you learn to analyze terrain like that?" Sarah's response was simple but telling. "I've been studying every manual I can find, Sergeant Johnson. I figure the more I know, the better Marine I'll be, and the more likely I am to bring my fellow Marines home alive." Sergeant Davis took the longest to come around, mainly because his objections to Sarah had been the most personal. He had genuinely believed that the Marines were no place for small women, and Sarah's success challenged everything he thought he knew about military service. The turning point came during a field exercise where Sarah's squad was pinned down by simulated enemy fire. The scenario called for someone to make a dangerous run across open ground to establish communications with headquarters. It was exactly the kind of situation where Sarah's small size would normally be seen as a disadvantage, but Sarah volunteered immediately, and when Sergeant Davis tried to assign the mission to someone else, she respectfully but firmly insisted that she was the best choice for the job. Her reasoning was sound. She was the fastest runner in the squad, the smallest target, and she had demonstrated the best performance under pressure. Sarah completed the mission flawlessly, using cover and movement techniques that impressed even the experienced Marines observing the exercise. When she returned to her squad's position, she found Sergeant Davis looking at her with something she had never seen from him before: genuine respect. "Martinez," he said after the exercise was over, "I owe you an apology. When you first got here, I didn't think you belonged. I was wrong. You're not just Marine material, you're leadership material." The last holdout was Sergeant Brooks, but his resistance wasn't based on doubt about Sarah's abilities. Instead, he seemed to be testing something deeper, something about her character and her long-term potential. His final test came during the most stressful week of boot camp, when everything the recruits had learned was put to the ultimate examination. The final weeks of boot camp brought the ultimate test that every Marine recruit must face: the Crucible. This 54-hour challenge would push every recruit to their absolute limits, testing not just their physical strength and technical skills, but their character, their teamwork, and their determination to never leave a fellow Marine behind. Sarah entered the Crucible as a completely different person than the quiet, uncertain girl who had stepped off the bus 11 weeks earlier. Her fellow recruits now looked to her for leadership and guidance. Even recruits from other platoons had heard stories about the small girl who had refused to quit despite facing the worst treatment the drill instructors could deliver. But Sergeant Brooks had one final test planned, one that would determine whether Sarah truly belonged among the Marines or was simply good at surviving training. He had arranged for Sarah to face the most challenging leadership scenario of the entire Crucible, a situation where failure would mean not just her own elimination, but potentially the failure of her entire team. The scenario was brutal in its simplicity. Sarah's squad was given a mission to transport critical supplies across 10 miles of difficult terrain while carrying a simulated wounded Marine. The wounded Marine was actually a 200-pound dummy that required 2 people to carry effectively. Sarah's squad consisted of herself and 5 other recruits, 3 of whom were among the weakest performers in the platoon. What made the situation truly impossible was the terrain. The route included steep hills, dense woods, rocky creek crossings, and a final climb up a nearly vertical cliff face. Even with a full squad of strong recruits, the mission would have been extremely difficult. With Sarah's mixed group, it seemed impossible. Sergeant Brooks watched from a distance as Sarah examined the route and assessed her team's capabilities. He expected her to either complain about the unfair assignment or to attempt the mission and fail spectacularly, proving that she might be good at individual tasks but couldn't handle real leadership responsibility. Instead, Sarah surprised him by doing something that showed she had learned the most important lesson of Marine training. The mission comes first, but you never leave anyone behind. Rather than trying to brute force her way through the mission, Sarah spent the first hour studying the terrain and talking to each member of her team. She learned about their individual strengths and weaknesses, their fears and their motivations. She discovered that Rodriguez was afraid of heights but excellent with navigation. Johnson was struggling with an injured knee but had the best upper body strength in the group. Williams was out of shape but had grown up hiking in similar terrain. Sarah then did something that no recruit had ever done in that particular scenario. She completely redesigned the mission approach. Instead of following the obvious direct route, she plotted a longer but more manageable path that avoided the worst terrain while still meeting the mission objectives. She divided the team into specialized roles based on their individual abilities, turning their weaknesses into manageable challenges rather than mission-ending obstacles. The execution was flawless. Rodriguez navigated them through the complex terrain without a single wrong turn. Johnson and Williams alternated carrying the heavy dummy, with other team members providing support and rest breaks. Sarah herself took point during the most dangerous crossings, using her small size and improved climbing skills to secure ropes and safety lines for the rest of the team. But the real test came during the final cliff climb. This was where previous groups had failed, where the combination of exhaustion, difficult terrain, and the weight of the dummy had proven too much for most teams. As they approached the base of the cliff, Johnson's injured knee finally gave out completely. He couldn't put any weight on it, much less climb a vertical rock face. According to the exercise rules, Sarah could leave him behind with one other person for security and continue the mission with the remaining team members. It would have been the tactically sound decision. Instead, Sarah made a choice that would be talked about in Marine training circles for years to come. She refused to leave anyone behind, even though it meant redesigning her approach for the third time with only 2 hours left to complete the mission. Using techniques she had learned from studying mountain rescue manuals, Sarah created a rope and pulley system that allowed the team to haul both Johnson and the dummy up the cliff face. It required perfect coordination, absolute trust in each other, and physical effort that pushed every team member beyond what they thought they were capable of. Sergeant Brooks watched from the top of the cliff as Sarah's team appeared over the edge with 15 minutes to spare. Not only had they completed an impossible mission, but they had done it without leaving anyone behind and without compromising the mission objectives. As Sarah helped pull the last team member over the cliff edge, she found herself face to face with all 5 drill instructors who had made her first weeks of boot camp a living hell. But their expressions now showed something she had never seen from them before: genuine pride and respect. Sergeant Brooks stepped forward, his usual stern expression replaced by something that might have been a smile. "Martinez," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "that was outstanding leadership under impossible circumstances. You didn't just complete the mission, you redefined what was possible." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the senior drill instructor who had watched Sarah's entire journey, joined the group at the cliff top. "Martinez," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen thousands of recruits pass through training. "In 30 years of training Marines, I have never seen a recruit overcome more obstacles or show greater determination to succeed. You have earned the right to call yourself a Marine." As Sarah stood at attention, surrounded by the instructors who had once seemed like her greatest enemies, she realized that their cruel treatment had never been about breaking her down. It had been about building her up, about forcing her to become stronger than she ever thought possible. They had seen something in her that she hadn't even seen in herself, and they had pushed her until she found it. But the greatest moment was yet to come. Sergeant Brooks pulled Sarah aside as the other recruits celebrated their successful completion of the crucible. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something. Those first few weeks when we were so hard on you, it wasn't because we thought you'd fail. It was because we could see you had the potential to be exceptional, and exceptional Marines are forged in exceptional circumstances." Sarah looked at him with new understanding. "You were testing me to see if I would break or if I would become stronger." "Exactly. And you didn't just become stronger, Martinez. You became the kind of Marine that other Marines will follow into impossible situations, because they know you'll find a way to bring them all home." Graduation day at Paris Island dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crisp autumn air that seemed perfect for new beginnings. Sarah stood in formation with her fellow Marines, no longer recruits but fully earned members of the world's most elite fighting force. The transformation was complete. visible not just in her physical appearance but in the way she carried herself, the confidence in her eyes, and the respect she commanded from everyone around her. The ceremony was everything Sarah had imagined and more. Families filled the bleachers, proud parents and siblings cheering as their loved ones officially became United States Marines. Sarah's mother had made the trip from Detroit, sitting in the front row with tears streaming down her face. She could hardly believe that the confident, strong woman in uniform was the same small girl she had, worried about just 13 weeks. But the most meaningful moment came when the 5 drill instructors who had once made Sarah's life so difficult approached her after the ceremony. They came not as tormentors but as mentors who had successfully guided her through the most challenging experience of her life. Sergeant Thompson was the first to shake her hand. "Martinez, I want you to know that you changed the way I think about what makes a good Marine. It's not about size or strength. It's about heart and determination, and you've got more of both than most people I've trained." Sergeant Williams pulled out a small notebook and showed Sarah a page where he had been tracking her progress. "Look at this," he said with genuine pride. "Your improvement in every single category was off the charts. You didn't just meet Marine standards, you exceeded them in ways that surprised even us." Sergeant Johnson, who had once designed cruel tests specifically to break her spirit, now spoke with deep respect. "Martinez, I've been training Marines for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone overcome more obstacles or show greater mental toughness. You're going to make an outstanding Marine leader." Sergeant Davis, who had been the most resistant to accepting Sarah, was now one of her strongest supporters. "I owe you more than just an apology," he said. "I owe you thanks for teaching me that being a Marine isn't about fitting into some preconceived notion of what a warrior looks like. It's about having the warrior spirit, and you've got that in abundance." Finally, Sergeant Brooks approached with something Sarah had never seen from him: a genuine smile. "Martinez, I have something for you," he said, handing her an official Marine Corps document. "This is a letter of recommendation for Officer Candidate School. If you want it, there's a place waiting for you in the next class." Sarah looked at the document in amazement. Officer training meant the chance to become a Marine officer, to lead other Marines in real missions, to take on responsibilities that she had never even dreamed of when she first arrived at Parris Island. "But why?" she asked, looking at the 5 instructors who surrounded her. "Why did you put me through all of that if you always intended to recommend me for officer training?" Sergeant Brooks's answer was simple but profound. "Because officers face challenges that are 100 times worse than anything we put you through here. We needed to know that when things get truly impossible, when lives are on the line and failure isn't an option, you would find a way to succeed. You proved that you would." The other recruits who had graduated with Sarah gathered around to congratulate her on the officer recommendation. Even Jackson, who had been so critical during the early weeks, came forward with genuine admiration. "Sarah," she said, using her first name for the first time since they'd met, "I want to apologize for how I treated you at the beginning. I thought you were going to make things harder for all of us. Instead, you showed us all what was possible when someone refuses to give up. You made all of us better Marines." As Sarah looked around at her fellow graduates, she realized that her journey had been about more than just proving herself. Her refusal to quit, her determination to excel despite unfair treatment, her commitment to helping others even when she was struggling herself, all of these had inspired the people around her to be better than they thought they could be. 3 months later, Sarah was back at Quantico, this time for officer candidate school. The challenges were even greater than at boot camp, but she faced them with the confidence that came from knowing she had already overcome the impossible. The small girl who had once been called weak and told she didn't belong was now training to become a Marine officer. The 5 drill instructors from Parris Island kept in touch with Sarah throughout her officer training. They had become more than instructors. They were mentors and friends who had played a crucial role in her transformation. When Sarah graduated from officer candidate school as the honor graduate of her class, all 5 were in the audience, prouder than if she had been their own daughter. Years later, when Sarah had become a decorated Marine officer serving in combat zones around the world, she would often think back to those first terrible weeks at Parris Island. She understood now that the 5 drill instructors hadn't been trying to destroy her. They had been forging her into something stronger than she ever could have become on her own. During her first deployment to Afghanistan, Sarah found herself in command of a platoon that included several Marines, who reminded her of herself during those early days at boot camp. There was Private Chen, a quiet young man from San Francisco who seemed overwhelmed by the intensity of military life. There was Lance Corporal Rodriguez, a woman from rural Texas who doubted her own abilities despite excellent performance. And there was Private First Class Johnson, a former gang member from Chicago who carried anger and defensive attitudes that masked deep insecurity. Sarah recognized the same potential in these Marines that Sergeants Thompson, Williams, Johnson, Davis, and Brooks had seen in her. She began applying the lessons she had learned, not through cruelty or unfair treatment, but through firm guidance, high expectations, and unwavering support. She pushed her Marines to exceed their own expectations while making it clear that she believed in their ability to succeed. When Private Chen struggled with confidence during patrol missions, Sarah gave him increasingly important responsibilities, showing him through action that she trusted his judgment. When Lance Corporal Rodriguez doubted her leadership abilities, Sarah made her assistant squad leader and mentored her through the challenges of commanding other Marines. When Private First Class Johnson's anger threatened to undermine unit cohesion, Sarah took the time to understand his background and help him channel his intensity into positive leadership. The transformation she witnessed in her own Marines proved that the methods used by her drill instructors had been right, even if they had seemed harsh at the time. The difference was that Sarah now understood the purpose behind the pressure, and she could apply it with wisdom and compassion, rather than simple toughness. On her last day at Paris Island before shipping out to officer training, Sarah had made a promise to herself. She vowed that she would never forget the lesson she had learned about the difference between being labeled as weak and actually being weak. She promised that whenever she encountered someone who was being dismissed or underestimated, she would give them the same chance to prove themselves that she had fought so hard to earn. Now, as Lieutenant Martinez led her platoon through the challenges of combat deployment, that promise guided every decision she made. The girl who had once been told she was too small, too weak, and too fragile to be a Marine had become the kind of officer that other Marines would follow anywhere, because they knew she would never ask them to do something she hadn't already done herself. The 5 drill instructors who had played such a crucial role in her development would have been proud to see how completely Sarah had internalized their lessons. She had learned that true strength wasn't about being the biggest or the loudest or the most aggressive. True strength was about refusing to quit when everything seemed impossible, about finding ways to succeed when others said it couldn't be done, and about lifting up the people around you even when you were struggling yourself. Sarah Martinez had turned the tables on everyone who had ever labeled her as weak. But more importantly, she had learned to help others do the same thing. The small girl from Detroit had become not just a Marine, but the kind of leader who could see potential where others saw only problems, and who could turn that potential into something extraordinary. In the end, those 5 Marines who couldn't stand her during those first weeks at boot camp had given her the greatest gift of all. They had refused to accept anything less than her absolute best, and in doing so, they had helped her discover that her absolute best was far more than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined possible.